The impossible bomb is really the antidote to the film Oppenheimer. It concentrates on a group of people whose names I'd never heard. They've been largely forgotten. The reason for that is that they've actually been actively written out of history. They included Nobel Prize winners. They included Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, a rather small number of people. But the truth is that without them, the Manhattan Project would never have been set up. Los Alamos, the fabulous bomb factory that the Americans put together in the New Mexico desert, that would never have happened. And there would have been no atomic bombs to drop on Japan during the Second World War. This is about rewriting a pretty important stretch of history. It's a rather grim tale, but it is something of a scientific thriller as well. So here's the conventional timeline as it's commonly told, including in the film Oppenheimer and the book on which it was based. In August 1939, which is a few months after the discovery of nuclear fission, which is the source of energy that fuels the atomic bomb, Albert Einstein wrote a letter to President Roosevelt warning him of the possible repercussions of the discovery of fission, and specifically that the Germans might be working on an atomic bomb. You wind forward 3 years to August 1942, and the Manhattan Project is set up. Wind forward another 3 years after that, and you're in August 1945, where the atomic bombs are actually dropped on Hiroshima on the 6th of August and on Nagasaki on the 9th of August. So to start the story properly, we have to wind back to Birmingham in the spring of 1940, where there's a young Jewish refugee physicist called Otto Frisch, and he fled from Nazi Germany. He ended up in Birmingham. Because he was an alien, in inverted commas, he was barred from taking part in one of the top secret research projects in the Department of Physics at Birmingham. And instead, he was left to his own devices, and he decided to look at the nature of fission, and specifically whether you could make a bomb of pure uranium-235. So natural uranium consists of a large amount, over 99%, of an isotope called U-238, uranium-238. And this stuff can't explode. It's essentially inert. It's intermingled with less than 1% of a very lively isotope called uranium-235, U-235. And what Frisch attempted to do was to work out, if you had a mass of pure U-35, what neutrons would do to this, and whether you could make a bomb from it. And his first calculations came up with the astonishing answer that with just 1 or 2 kilograms of pure U-235, you could make a super bomb that would be powerful enough to flatten a city center. Now, by pure coincidence, in Birmingham at exactly the same time was another refugee Jewish physicist from Germany, a man called Rudolf Peierls. And he was a mathematical theoretical physicist, and he, being also an alien, was barred from the top secret project, which was to do with radar, which had mopped up all the resources and labs in Birmingham. So he and Frisch were essentially out on a limb. They were allowed to do anything they wanted to, as long as it didn't cost anything, and as long as it didn't interfere with the top secret project going on elsewhere. The two of them got together and they thought about this super bomb that Frisch had envisaged. They redid the calculations and they agreed that this was a distinct possibility. And following that, they wrote a memorandum. And this is really the starting point of the atomic bomb, the first practicable, workable atomic bomb. And the Frisch-Peierls memorandum was written either in February or March 1940. They didn't bother to make another date. They put it together. They took it to their head of department, a man called Mark Oliphant, who was a very interesting, volatile, hot-tempered Australian. And the hot temper is absolutely crucial. It comes back into the story in dramatic fashion later on. And Oliphant was immediately persuaded that this was worth going with. And he recommended that they write the memorandum, and he would then take it to a committee, actually in the Ministry of Air Supply, which dealt with off-the-wall ideas that could change the course of the war. So the Frisch-Peierls memorandum ends up creating a specialized committee to look at the possibility of the British building an atomic bomb. And this was all happening during late spring 1940, so a couple of years before the Manhattan Project was set up. And the committee was called MAUD. So the MAUD committee was set up under the aegis of Sir George Thompson, who was a Nobel Prize winner. He dragged in 3 or 4 other Nobel Prize winners, including, crucially, James Chadwick, who had discovered the neutron, and several others who were Nobel laureates in physics and chemistry. And they went at the Frisch-Piles memorandum. They tested it to destruction. And a year later, in July 1941, they wrote a report which indicated that the bomb actually was feasible. They put it through the mincer, they tried to tear it apart, they got external opinions, and they decided that actually the bomb was feasible. George Thompson's words were, "We were the first to say that the bomb would work." However, it could only work in conjunction with the Americans, because by then Britain was being bombarded from the air by the Luftwaffe. They worked out that to make enough pure uranium-235, you would need an enrichment plant which covered about 40 acres. And with everything being bombed to hell by the Luftwaffe, it would just be impossible to set up a top-secret facility of that size without it attracting enemy interest and getting bombed. So the bomb is feasible, but it can only be built in collaboration with the Americans. So now we've got to jump back over to the other side of the Atlantic to find out what's happened to Einstein's letter to Roosevelt. And the short answer is absolutely nothing. Amazingly, Roosevelt said, if this means that the Nazis are going to blow us up, we've got to do something. Action is required. But he went about it in a remarkably vague way. He appointed an economist who'd actually brought Einstein's letter to him. He was a personal friend of one of Einstein's friends. They set up a committee of people to look at the possibility of making a uranium bomb. At this stage, they didn't know anything about the Frisch-Piles memorandum or anything happening in Britain. So they were looking at the bomb from scratch. And the committee was initially purely military men with an economist and chaired by a soil scientist. None of them had any understanding whatsoever of nuclear physics. And they decided that the bomb was impractical. It would cost an awful lot of money. It would be ready for the war after next, was what the military men told them. And you just have to jump back to the other side of the Atlantic and compare George Thompson's Maud Committee, where you've got 6 Nobel Prize winners in chemistry, in nuclear physics, trying to evaluate what was happening. So back to the Americans, the committee went through various iterations, and at every stage, they decided that this project simply wasn't fundable. And this state of play went on until July 1941. By then, the scientific administrators had asked the top American scientists of the National Academy of Sciences secretly what their opinion of a uranium bomb would be. And they all said, like the military men earlier on, that this was simply a non-starter. So what happens in July 1941 is that the Maud Committee final report is actually handed to the Americans together with all the top secret British deliberations that had led up to that point. And the Americans didn't bother to reply. So what's going on? Well, in that same month, Mark Oliphant, the volatile, hot-tempered Australian, he decided to go to America to find out what on earth was happening. Why were the Americans failing to respond at all to this gift of information in the Frisch-Piles memorandum and the final Maud Committee report? And he actually went and hammered on the door of the chairman of the Uranium Committee and discovered that this man had received the final report, had looked at it, couldn't understand a word of it because his background wasn't in nuclear physics, and locked it in his safe. By that time, there were a few top-quality American physicists on his uranium committee, but by locking the documents in the safe because he didn't understand them, he denied them access to the up-to-date British intelligence. And when Mark Oliphant discovered what had happened, he went ballistic. He was very cruel to the chairman who'd locked the stuff in his safe. He then went to talk to one of his friends, a physicist called Ernest Lawrence in Berkeley, California. And he and Mark Oliphant had collaborated on the design of a device called the cyclotron. This was a particle accelerator that won a Nobel Prize for Ernest Lawrence, and Mark Oliphant had been instrumental in helping him to refine the instrument. And Oliphant went with the aim of converting Ernest Lawrence into being a believer in the U-235 superbomb, and he succeeded. And from there, Lawrence then had the uphill task of converting all these other Americans who hadn't wanted to believe in the superbomb, or any possibility of a uranium bomb to believe in the Frisch-Piles U-235 bomb. Eventually they succeeded, and at around the same time that this was happening, a couple of Americans were sent to Britain to discover what the Brits were up to. And they returned and said, these guys are actually onto something. They're taking this very seriously. We believe that the bomb is actually credible, but it can only be done in collaboration with the Americans. And we think we ought to be with the Brits working on this now full time and with all energy. This all came together towards late autumn of 1941. Roosevelt was presented with the evidence and he said, we must collaborate. The final say-so was not given until the eve of Pearl Harbor in early December 1941. So if things had taken even a few days longer, if Oliphant hadn't been able to persuade his American colleagues that there was something in this strange British bomb, then it's possible that because America would then be dragged into the war, that this would have fallen by the wayside and nothing would have happened because they'd have much more urgent conventional priorities to deal with. Anyway, it went ahead. A few months later, the Manhattan Project was set up. That was in August 1942. The British were brought on board as a British mission to the Manhattan Project. There were about 60 of them. About 35 of them went to work in Berkeley with Ernest Lawrence, refining his cyclotron, his Nobel Prize winning device, into a machine which could concentrate uranium-235. The rest went to Los Alamos, which was the bomb factory set up by General Groves. He was appointed the director of the Manhattan Project. He was a US Army engineer who'd been responsible for masterminding the building of the Pentagon, and of course, Robert Oppenheimer. And this is up in the mountains of New Mexico. While the Manhattan Project was running, it was an extraordinary environment. If you read the accounts of what people said, they said it was like the greatest scientific club you could ever belong to. And again, if you read about what went on there in between the grim business of making two different kinds of atomic bomb, you see that Oppenheimer just did a magnificent job in bringing people together at the prime of their potential and melding them all together into a workforce that was very focused on what they had to do. And they were brought in to do a variety of tasks. They were led by James Chadwick, the man who had discovered the neutron. The first, I think the most amazing thing was to get on well with General Groves. And they were absolutely chalk and cheese personalities. Chadwick was quite a shy, retiring man. Groves was very bluff and very much in your face. The two of them decided they had to do business to get this thing done. He also went around all the places in the Manhattan Project looking to see where there were gaps in knowledge and workforce. And he then went back to Britain and plundered British universities. He brought the best people out in things like electronics, bomb damage, predicting the power of explosions and things like this. And the know-how for that did not exist in America. At Los Alamos, we've got both Otto Frisch and Rudolf Peierls. And they both contribute to the bomb design. The Hiroshima bomb, this was a device rather cynically known as Little Boy. This is actually a character from a Dashiell Hammett novel. And one of the key people working with Oppenheimer was a great fan of those books. So this is where Little Boy came from. So Little Boy was the U-235 bomb. Otto Frisch was the one who worked out from a very dangerous experiment. It was called the Dragon experiment. And the reason for that is that it was so dangerous, it was likened to tickling the tail of a sleeping dragon. So Otto Frisch works out that you need 52 kilograms of uranium-235 for Little Boy. And that then influences the timing of the bomb because they know how much can be delivered from the various enrichment plants delivering 235 to Los Alamos. What about Rudolf Peierls? Well, he and a man called Klaus Fuchs. Klaus Fuchs is well known. Really, he's best known because he was spying for the Russians and he was feeding all the secrets of the Los Alamos bomb project to the Russians while he was working there. He's the only Brit who appears in the film Oppenheimer. And the only reason he's there is because he was perfidious and a spy. So none of his scientific achievements, which were considerable, were mentioned. None of the contributions of the other Brits at Los Alamos were mentioned at all in the film, and very little in the book on which the film is based. So Klaus Fuchs, like Peierls, was a very high-level mathematical theoretical physicist. And they worked out initially how best to concentrate uranium-235 using a different method from the calutron. It was a gaseous diffusion method. It meant trying to separate the slightly lighter isotope 235 from the heavyweight 238 by pushing it through effectively a semi-permeable membrane, which let the lighter one go through more quickly. They were instrumental in working out the physics of that. And crucially, a little factory near Swansea in South Wales produced the ideal membrane material. So without Fuchs and Piles, and without the little factory in Swansea in South Wales, then there wouldn't have been enough uranium-235 to make the Hiroshima bomb. What about the Nagasaki bomb? This is based on plutonium, which is a man-made element. Tiny amounts of it were made for the first time and isolated and were analyzed back in 1940-41. It's a huge leap to get from those sub-microgram amounts into the 6 kilos you needed for the bomb that was dropped to Nagasaki. And at the very heart of this bomb, you had a small sphere of plutonium with a tiny thing called an initiator at the center of it. And this would be the thing that would cause the nuclear chain reaction, vastly more powerful even than the one of uranium-235, which would detonate the bomb. In order to detonate it, they worked out that the best way to do this was to crush the plutonium sphere with a huge ball of conventional explosive. In order for that to be focused inwards, they had to have mathematical calculations. So James Tuck does the shaped explosive. Klaus Fuchs and Rudolf Piles do the geometry of how to arrange the shaped explosive to crush this plutonium ball. Also, Rudolf Piles is one of the two people who put in the top secret patent for the initiator, this little device at the very heart of the plutonium sphere, which would ensure that everything exploded at the moment that the plutonium sphere was crushed right down. So we put that lot together. In brief, neither the uranium bomb, Little Boy, dropped in Hiroshima, 6th of August 1945, nor the big bomb called Fat Man, that's another Dashiell Hammett character. It's not a snide reference to Winston Churchill, as has been suggested, dropped in Nagasaki on the 9th of August 1945. Neither of those bombs could have been ready without the British contributions in the Manhattan Project.